Our next speaker is Denise Knapp, and Denise is the Director of Conservation and Education at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, as well as finishing up her doctoral degree at the UC Santa Barbara. So she has 2 full-time jobs right now and is juggling them very admirably. She's part of what she's been working on. She has a broad background, has been working on islands for a long time, did a lot of work at Catalina Island Conservancy before she decided to go back and get her PhD. And she's going to be discussing some of the lessons that have been learned from the islands in terms of monitoring restoration across all of the islands. So with that, please join me in welcoming Denise Knapp.
All right, well, thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm going to be sharing some stories, basically, a series of stories from the Channel Islands that I think will guide this discussion, will contribute to this discussion of restoration. But first, I have to orient you to the Channel Islands in case you're not already familiar with them. There's 8 of them off the coast here, generally northern and southern, 4 of each, and they're owned by a variety of different land managers, the Park Service, the Nature Conservancy, the Catalina Island Conservancy, and the Navy. So Santa Cruz is the largest island. It's owned both by the Nature Conservancy and the Park Service. And then the Park Service owns San Miguel, Santa Rosa, Anacapa, and Santa Barbara. The Navy owns San Nicolas and San Clemente. And then the Catalina Island Conservancy owns Catalina Island. So the garden, where I work now, has had a long role on the Channel Islands from the era of exploration and now into the era of restoration. So from Ralph Hoffman in the 1920s, collecting plants out on the Channel Islands, a number of floras have been produced, descriptions of the terrestrial vegetation out there, research on the rare plants, and information on monitoring of the vegetation communities. And all of this contributes to what we need to know to reassemble these communities in restoration. And now we're entering the era of restoration. I've started a collaboration with USGS and National Park Service. We're looking at Santa Rosa Island and the rebuilding of ecological networks there in highly degraded sites. So what these islands share, this archipelago, is a legacy of degradation. Decades, centuries of introduced animals, a legacy of ranching that has degraded the landscape in some cases pretty severely, like the large photo on the right there. Those trees could be walking on stilts. Those are the roots that have been exposed from the loss of the topsoil. And it's been found that active restoration really is needed in a lot of cases. So there was a study by Hanley, McEachern et al. That looked at long-term vegetation monitoring data on Santa Barbara Island and showed that over the last 27 years, the communities are shifting away from native species. So it's not going in the right direction. We do need to step in. And the islands, the reason I'm talking about them, there's a lot of great examples of large-scale projects that we can learn from. And when I say large-scale, that can be spatially, so not just an acre or 2 or 10, but hundreds of acres, thousands of acres. It could be temporally, so not just a year or 2, but where we actually are tracking this long enough that we can see if we're having the desired effect. Or ecologically, where you're not just looking at single species, but you're looking at a whole community and an ecosystem. So how are these island land managers doing that? Well, there's a couple of benefits of working on an island. For one, a ready source of volunteers. It's a great way to get out to the islands that otherwise might be somewhat difficult to get to. Also, islands are just already intriguing and beautiful and exotic, and so that psychological war is already somewhat won on those islands. Also, the land managers, for the most part, have the imperative of protecting and restoring these systems to start with. So what can we learn from these projects, and how can we all do more is the subject of this talk. So plenty of constraints to choose from. I started preparing this talk by thinking about all the constraints I could think of and then moving forward with that. And the first one that comes to mind probably for all of us is few resources, whether that's time or labor. Another one that comes up is unintended consequences, where you have a restoration action and that leads to an undesired and unforeseen consequence. And an example that's well known is on Santa Cruz Island, where the invasive fennel proliferated following the removal of feral sheep. Another is unclear reference conditions, and that's come up a couple of times already today. On the islands, they are each other's analog, basically. It's harder to compare to the mainland. Issues that cross owner boundaries. So if you're dealing with invasive species, you don't want to be removing them lower in a watershed when your neighbor has them up above you. Plenty more to choose from. No problem there. But today I want to focus on solutions. So I'm actually going to start with the solution and then list the problems that it addresses. So solution number one is to form partnerships. The islands have done this really well. That solves the problem of few resources. You're pooling your energy, your labor force. You're not reinventing any wheels. Issues that cross owner boundaries, which I just described, and unclear reference conditions. So one example of the benefit of partnerships is island information sharing, so that, again, you're not reinventing any wheels. If your neighbor was able to do a study looking at the past vegetation on the island, you can take advantage of that. Or if there's little remnants of native habitat found around, then we can learn from each other. One example of how they do that is the California Island Symposium, which is held about every 3 to 5 years. And pretty much if you do any kind of research on the islands, you come to this symposium and share it. Another is the Island Fox Recovery Team. The fox will come up a number of times in this talk. Biosecurity Working Group, where the islands are working together to prevent future introductions that could be devastating. There's a Channel Islands Weed and Restoration Group that meets quarterly. And then there used to be a Channel Islands Research Coordinating Committee, which I'd love to see reinvigorated, that was really more the late 80s, early 90s. So my next partnership example is from Catalina Island, where I worked for 8 years. And basically my boss at the time, Peter Schuyler, got a grant to do oak ecosystem restoration. It was a 4-year grant. And we started by convening experts from all over the nation, really. They came from different universities and nonprofits and things. And we brought them together for a workshop to talk about what we know about the oak ecosystem on the island. It was clear that there wasn't a lot of reproduction going on. There was evidence of a large-scale dieback of those oaks. So we talked about what our knowledge was. We wanted to get started restoring this system right away. But what we determined in this workshop with all these brains together was that we had a number of information gaps, that there were things we needed to know more about the threats. We needed to actually know for sure that when you look at the population dynamics, these oaks are indeed declining. So what we did was we decided what we really needed to know. We formed a number of partnerships and then began a lot of studies. And then in 4 years, when we collected the data from these studies, we reconvened, had another workshop, symposium, and then we published the results of these studies. And the result is that the sum was much greater than the parts, because each of these studies sort of fed off of each other, contributed to each other, and really gave us a better sense of what was going on the island. Another partnerships example is from San Nicolas Island, owned by the Navy, and their feral cat removal project. They wanted to do something about the cats. They did a feasibility study in 2006 to figure out what they could do about those cats. And as you can imagine, cats are beloved, and they got 5,000 comment letters about what they should do about the cats. And they pretty much decided right from the get-go, well, we can't use poisons. We can't use non-padded leg traps. We can't use immunocontraceptives. So they decided what they couldn't do. And then they set about doing some trapping. They tried doing some box trapping to see if that would work. Well, it didn't. It didn't work at all. And so then they decided, they formed these partnerships between, you can see the logos on the bottom, Island Conservation, the Humane Society, the Institute for Wildlife Studies, and they all came together to come to a mutually agreeable solution. And they decided to use modified padded leg hold traps to live capture these animals, and only when necessary to use lethal means. And it was an amazing success with a lot of ingenuity. They captured 66 cats from the island, and then confirmed that indeed all of the animals were removed from the island, and they transported them to a facility on the mainland where they were cared for by the Humane Society. A few had to be lethally controlled, but deemed quite an ecological feat, the largest success without toxicants, and the 5th largest island cat eradication. Solution number 2 is to take an ecosystem or a watershed approach, to think bigger. And the problems addressed here include unintended consequences, prioritizing many needs, so again dealing with low resources, and also balancing conflicting needs. And my first example is from San Clemente Island with the island shrike versus the fox. So this is the island shrike. It's federally endangered. At one time the population was down to only 17. And this is the San Clemente Island fox, one of 6 unique subspecies found on the different islands. And there's a paper by Romer and Wayne from 2003 that tracks the saga of these recovery efforts for the island shrike. And they state that the fox basically became threatened by the shrike recovery efforts on the island. And what they did was they had both a captive breeding program for the shrikes, but then they had predator control as well, which involved translocating and sometimes euthanizing the foxes to keep them from predating on these shrikes. So that's kind of a problem, though. So they suggest that a more balanced ecosystem approach would have been the better way to go. For instance, considering the ecological role of each of these species. For instance, the foxes, it's been shown with, they've declined on a number of the islands, and that's been sort of a natural experiment to show when these foxes decline, they're an important predator. You get rodents increasing dramatically, and then those rodents eat the seeds of the plants that then can't reproduce. So major community role here. So if you're favoring the shrike over the fox, then you might get sort of out of balance. The other is to enhance habitat, to think about the cause of the decline in the first place. And there's a long history of degradation on the island from ranching or introduced animals. And basically the shrubland that's needed to form this complex habitat that supports the prey for the animal, as well as perching sites for them to hunt and refugia for their own escape from predation, was lacking. So by enhancing habitat, you're actually benefiting not only the shrike but also the fox at the same time. And that's what the Navy's been doing. They've been planting native plants, and it's working. The shrike population is up to 140 at this point. Another example of the ecosystem approach on the northern islands that's working involves foxes, eagles, pigs, and fennel. So this is the island fox, again, unique subspecies on 6 of the islands, and on 3 of the northern islands the population declined, in large part due to predation by golden eagles, which did not have a permanent presence historically on the islands. And one of the reasons they're thought to have come in was because the bald eagles went away because of DDT and eggshell thinning. And they're thought to have previously deterred those golden eagles. The the golden eagles also predate on the introduced feral pigs, which are prolific and provide a ready food source, but actually they're harder to catch than the foxes. So it turns out the foxes were the big losers here. And then the pigs promote invasive fennel, which decreases habitat and for native plants. They promote that through their rooting activities and disturbance. So what the Park Service has done is not only have a captive breeding program and immunization program for the foxes, but also looking at all of these interactions where they live captured and translocated the golden eagles. For the bald eagles, there's a reintroduction program that Institute for Wildlife Studies has been doing, and in 2006, the first naturally hatched chicks in 50 years. So that's successful. The Nature Conservancy removed the pigs from the island, and of course with partners, and then they're all working to control the funnel. Another example of the ecosystem approach is on Catalina Island. I'm going to go back to that oak ecosystem story where we produced this proceedings about the oaks, and we learned that yes, indeed, oaks are declining. The threats include annual grasses, deer, bison. However, the idea was to think about the ecosystem in a much broader context. We had answers from other aspects of it as well, but it needed to be bigger. And so addressing that, the major ecosystem threats include increasing fire frequency. So that's been documented that the fire frequency is increasing. It's mostly because of human causes. And the problem is that when the fire frequency is too high, there's not enough time for the shrublands to recover. Another is roads, which traverse the majority of the island. And when you look at the impacts, the buffer zones around those roads and the impacts, it's influencing almost the entire island. Another is hydrologic alteration in the form of either dams or groundwater reduction. And then lastly, invasive species, including the exotic annual grasses shown here. And then these threats have interactions and facilitations. For instance, hydrologic alteration, dams favor invasive bullfrogs. There's a lot of examples of where these interact and facilitate each other. So I worked to map some of the interactions to provide management recommendations that might maximize benefits while avoiding unintended consequences. And so here's an example where the island has a lot of roads, and the roads directly promote increased fire frequency, one of those threats. They also introduce fragmentation, which is a big deal, especially for smaller organisms. They also are a direct source of mortality for the island fox, which was also endangered on Catalina, and during the captive breeding program was the highest source of mortality for these foxes. So then increased fire promotes the annual grasses at the expense of the shrubland, and this is called the grass-fire cycle, where then the annual grasses in turn are highly ignitable and promote that fire. The invasive annual grasses have been shown to then compete with the oaks and the shrubs and the native grasses to their detriment. So you have this stepped influence here. And then when you have increasing fragmentation from these roads, this promotes invasive species like rats that are adapted to this kind of influence. And then the rats provide a ready food source for the cats. Together, the rats and the cats decrease the native shrew and the mice. So when you just start with the roads, you realize, wow, there's this cascading influence that if you took out a few roads, relatively innocuous thing to do, you could really benefit the ecosystem. And another last example on Catalina Island is the watershed approach. This started with my husband, who basically hiked the whole island and mapped the weeds, 76 different species, mapped 35,000 populations of these weeds, and then did a ranking to figure out which are the ones to control first. And the thing is that you can then eradicate a few of them that are low in abundance, but some of them you just have to control in selected areas. Well, how do you select those areas is the question. And so how do you prioritize? So we collaborated with other collaborators. We looked at the watersheds on the island, 76 of them, and then we ranked them together for rare plants, rare wildlife, and vegetation to figure out where should we start. And what we ended up with was one of the most highly ranked watersheds on the island was Upper and Lower Cottonwood Canyon, which is one of the only places on the island with a permanent water source. And a couple of the rare resources there include the two-striped garter snake and the Catalina Island shrew. And then by knowing that this is one of the areas with the highest amount of resources, then the Conservancy could focus some of their efforts on removing invasive plants like Genista linifolia in this watershed. Solution number 3 is to multitask, and the problem addressed here is few resources. And I have one example of that, and that's on Santa Cruz Island, where I already said that they removed the pigs. And this was supposed to take 3 years, but it actually ended up taking 16 months. They did it with a company that used a helicopter that it's small and it can get down low. And they decided, well, let's use the rest of this time wisely. And so in 2007, it took 41 days and covered the 62,000 acres on the island. But they surveyed 55 different invasive plants and mapped 5,000 populations of those invasive plants from the helicopter, again, so you could do a ranking. At that same time, they were able to do a golden eagle survey and a feral pig survey, and then to ground truth a vegetation map. So by using this modern tool, they were able to multitask and get a whole lot done and make their money go further. Then in 2012, over the course of 20 days, they had this map and this ranking, and then they treated these weeds, 24 different weeds treated in 900 infestations over the course of 20 days. And at the same time, 15 biosecurity stations monitored. This is, again, trying to prevent future introductions. 5 archaeological soil samples transported, and a bald eagle nest surveyed. Solution number 4 is tackling that psychological. More education and outreach, I think, is crucial. And the problems addressed are few resources, also a lack of understanding of what we're doing and why, and then public misconceptions, as well as public resistance. So my first example is to play up success stories, and the parks, the islands do this very well. For instance, the Catalina fox back from the brink, the captive breeding programs and translocations and immunizations have been very successful. Catalina bison get birth control to keep their numbers down, a nice non-controversial way to control the numbers of those bison. Feds declare victory against Anacapa Island rats, so they were actually able to remove all of the rats from Anacapa Island successfully, and all kinds of recovery since then. And then my favorite, really, the second chance happy endings, is pointing to the resources that are being protected on San Nicolas Island from the removal of those feral cats, rather than saying, hey, look, we got rid of these cats. They're saying, look, we're protecting all of these important resources. I'm going to transition from examples to suggestions, and my first suggestion is to emphasize habitats and interactions. So we're good at picking these species that become our ambassadors. I think we can still do that with lovable community representatives, but do it in a systems context. So for instance, we have that oak ecosystem on Catalina again. It's a beautiful system. People love hiking through the oaks already, but then you educate about all of the things that depend on this system. So like the orange crown warbler, which in the breeding season, 85% of its foraging is on oak trees because of all the insects supported by those oak trees. The beachy ground squirrel is an endemic squirrel on Catalina Island and also utilizes the oaks, the acorns, and the adjacent grassland. So package the deal, make it clear these interactions so we're moving above these single species battles. And then lastly, I feel that we need to get our message straight. I think it's been said, I think Bruce said, you know, it's unfortunate how few people understand what we're trying to do with ecological restoration and what it even is. And even internally, there's debate about how to go about it. So there was an article very recently by William Jordan, one of the founders of ecological restoration, and he made a number of important points. One is that the outdated view is that nature is in some sort of equilibrium or balance, and that we're restoring back to a certain particular point in time. The problem with that is that it's hard to explain how you pick that point in time. It starts to feel arbitrary. The modern view is that nature is dynamic and that we're restoring really more of a trajectory. So it's sort of like a snapshot versus a movie. The outdated view is also that we're restoring species or even assemblages of particular species. And the modern view is that we're restoring function, we're restoring biodiversity, and we're restoring resilience to the system. We're in a new world that's changing with climate change, and I think this is important to get across. Continuing on, here's that modern view again, what I just presented on. And the ultra-modern view, which you may or may not agree with, but it's out there. To restore function, we sometimes need to construct novel ecosystems. Sometimes there are invaders that are not going to go away. We don't have the technology yet to deal with them. I think Christy said, you know, annual grasses, gosh, what are you going to do? So sometimes if we can't do better, this is what we need to do. So here's the thing, is that we have these different views of restoration all encompassed under the term restoration. And here's a quote from William Jordan. He says, the model, if you're doing, quote, restoration, is the past. It's an historic, very likely ecologically obsolete ecosystem. If it's not, use another word. And so it could be that the word restoration isn't doing us any favors. It gives people the impression we're going back to some arbitrary point in time rather than restoring function and a trajectory. I'm just saying. So the message, to wrap it all up, tie it together, think big to go big. 1, more partnerships. 2, focus on ecosystems, watersheds, and habitats. 3, increase efficiency, use new tools. That was a multitasking example. And 4, tell the world. We just need to get the message out there way better. That's going to build that support, those volunteers, the money coming in, and allow us to do more, bigger, better.